Hello, everyone. I will start slowly while everybody logs in to today's webinar. Welcome. Today's webinar is our Community Needs Grants 2021 informational webinar. It's intended to provide you with more information about the Foundation's new Community Needs Grants and really to help you prepare to write and submit your proposal. My name is Jacqueline Hall. I'm the program manager at the Foundation responsible for these community needs grants. I also support our Rebuilding Lives and Girls Fund multi-year grants. Just a little housekeeping. I will try not to speak too quickly. I'm not always so great at it. So if I do, if you find that I'm going too quickly, you can either raise your hand or type it into the question box and I will slow down. We will keep all questions for the end of the presentation. You will see a Q&A box in the Zoom function or toolbar. Use that to input your questions at any time, but I will address them at the end of today's session. So welcome everyone. To get started, the Community Needs Grants are a new single-year funding stream at the Canadian Women's Foundation aimed at providing short-term flexible funding to support your organizations in offering programs and services that align with one of the Foundation's 4 work pillars. We'll get into those a little later. But some examples of what we mean by flexible funding. I know a lot of folks are used to having to apply for a project or program. This time around, you do not need to do that. So and these are examples. So you might want to supplement a funding gap for existing operational, administrative, or existing program costs. So these are things that you normally have paid out of other pots of funding and you just have a gap because you weren't able to fundraise. You could apply to pilot a new project or support program development or to adapt services using new technology or approaches. So just some examples. Again, we'll go over some more examples and criteria in a second. So community needs grants, we are giving out about 23 of them. The maximum amount an organization can apply for is $20,000 per organization. We will be issuing the funds in January. We will go through the work back dates soon, but you can anticipate that if you were successful in your application, that the money will come to you in January. Excuse me, that should say 2022. 2022 is the date, not 2021. The 2 main criteria, and these are things you must demonstrate in your application, is significant experience in offering programs, services, or undertaking advocacy initiatives by or with women, girls, two-spirit, trans, and non-binary folks who face multiple barriers and are underserved. And so while this is enumerated in the application, I will just read out what some of those are. So we are talking about First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people, Black people, racialized people, people living in rural, remote, or northern communities, 2S LGBTQI+ people, those living on low incomes, refugee, immigrant, or non-status people, people with disabilities, youth, and older people. The other criteria that you must demonstrate in your application, whether it's a program or operational supports that you're looking for, is that you have experience in undertaking programs, services, or leading advocacy initiatives that align with one of the 4 pillar areas of focus for the Canadian Women's Foundation. Those are gender-based violence, economic security, girls empowerment, and inclusive leadership. To be specific, that does not mean that you only need to, your organization must only be focused on those things, but you must have significant experience in leading one of those activities related to one of those 4 pillar areas. Additional considerations. So again, these are, I don't want to say that these are the criteria. They outline, though, however, things that the foundation looks for in your application, so that you apply a feminist intersectional analysis to your organizational structure and your activities. So does your staff, board, etc., as well as the work you do, reflect a feminist and intersectional analysis? That you understand the intersection of inequity and barriers to participation. So where race, class, gender, sexual identity, disability, etc., have compounding factors on access. That you use an asset-based positive approach that centers the knowledge and experience of your participants or your clients. So trying to work with as opposed to do for. That you are demonstrating that you consider the realities of participants' lives, given the focus of the foundation on funding activities or work for women, girls, Two-Spirit, and non-binary folks. That what we're talking about is that you have some other kind of wraparound supports or considerations for those folks. So example, you provide childcare, transportation assistance, and other things that help overcome barriers to accessing services. And then you have established partnerships with other local or community-based organizations that also have experience working with women, girls, Two-Spirit, trans, and non-binary people. Other things we're going to look for in your application, that you clearly communicate how the funds will be used to support either your organization's capacity to serve folks, or the project in question. So if you are applying for a project, how will the funds support that project? If you are applying for something more operation, how will it support your operations, and in turn, how your operations or project support or serve women, girls, Two-Spirit, trans, and non-binary people. And that you present a clear and balanced budget. There will be a budget form available in the online portal. There is a template that you can download and then re-upload to your application. It should be balanced and detailed. In terms of priorities, these are some considerations that our committee will use in assessing the applications we receive. So the Canadian Women's Foundation, excuse me, prioritizes inclusion and addressing barriers to access. Our vision of gender equality for all in our grant making is expressed in our prioritization of women, girls, Two-Spirit, trans, and non-binary people who face multiple barriers. In recognition of the long histories and ongoing effects of colonization, racism, violence, and exclusion, the foundation has increased our focus on the following communities: so Indigenous people, Black people, those with disabilities, and 2S LGBTQI+ people. So where organizations are led by and serving those communities, they will be given priority in the community's considerations. And the committee will also be prioritizing, where possible, grassroots organizations with small budgets. And that is loosely defined as organizations with an operating budget of less than $1 million per year, or shelters / transitional homes with an operating budget of less than $2 million per year, recognizing that sheltering often costs far more than other activities. Things to note: the foundation does not fund the same initiative more than 3 times and under any of our annual grant streams. So if you are looking to put forward an application for a project that the foundation has previously funded, that if it has been funded 3 times already, we will not consider it this time around. So please consider applying for different activities. Again, this year's community needs grants are fairly flexible and open, so you can apply for operational or administrative supports. It does not need to be an application for a project or program again. Things that the foundation does not fund, fairly common and standard of many charitable foundations. We do not fund individuals. What that means is if you are an academic researcher wanting to fund your PhD thesis, sadly, we will not be able to fund it. We do not fund federal, provincial, municipal agencies and school boards. For-profit-based organizations, so again, open to nonprofit organizations, and we will get into how charitable status comes into play momentarily. Do not fund fundraising events. Again, while we will support some operational costs here, we ask that you do not put forward an application to pull together your annual fundraiser. Conferences, seminars, symposiums, or any other synonym referring to a one-time only event in your year. The foundation does not fund or will not consider one-off type of events. Any project activities outside of Canada. You may be an international organization, or you do some work outside of Canada, but those activities cannot be funded. So we will only fund work happening within the Canadian context. Projects that are not primarily focused on women, girls, two-spirit, trans, and non-binary people. So again, if you are a multi-service agency that also serves men, you can apply for funding, but for those activities that are supporting women, girls, two-spirit, trans, and non-binary people, we will not, the foundation does not fund activities for men. Deficit or emergency funding. Again, we are talking about supporting operations and administrative costs, sometimes exclusively in this grant stream, but we can't help you pay off some outstanding debts, for example. Films or videos, unless they're part of a larger project. So if you're undertaking a youth initiative and they want to develop a video or a film, great. But we are looking to fund the wider scope of that activity. Capital expenditures, so you can apply for equipment costs, some modest furniture. You unfortunately cannot apply for a renovation, new build, or other large building project. And self-defense training, particularly if it's the only or the primary activity of a project. From a timeline perspective, here are some key dates that will let you know what our work back dates look like. So applications are due at 6 p.m. on August 6th at 4 p.m. Eastern time. So if you are on the East Coast or the West Coast, you will need to make the adjustment to reflect 4 p.m. Eastern. So if you're in British Columbia, it's 1 p.m. your time. If you're in Newfoundland, it's 5:30 p.m. If you're needing any support on that, let me know. The committee of volunteers that reviews all of the grant applications will do so throughout August and September, and they will meet in October to make final selections of which 23 grants will receive funding. Sadly, which few hundred will not. And that list of recommended projects or initiatives are approved by our board in November. All applicants will receive good or bad news in December via email. And for those who are successful, you will receive your contracts and other required paperwork at that time. Depending how quickly things move along, the funding may come slightly earlier than January, but we are aiming to get all payments out in early January 2022. Getting started. So we'll go through some of the technical aspects of where things exist and how to navigate the online portal. So before you start, we have developed 3 key documents. They exist on the Canadian Foundation's website. If you go to the main page, canadianwomen.org, you will see in our drop-down menu a page that says Community Grants 2021. Otherwise, you can use the hyperlinks that are in this slide. You'll see along the right-hand side of the page links to our grant guidelines, the instructions, and the frequently asked questions section. These will, the grant guidelines ultimately give you more information and detail on the criteria. The application instructions provide detail on how to respond to each question. So if a question seems a bit fuzzy, you are not sure how to respond, this document will help you understand what perhaps what we're looking for in more detail. And the frequently asked questions. There are some questions that we have received many, many times. Your question may be one of them. So I suggest looking here before sending off an email or giving us a ring, just to see if the information is there. Getting started in the online portal. So you've gotten to the page, you'll see the navigation link to get to the online portal, especially if this is your first time. You may have not seen this before or know where to find it, so look on our website. You will click the register button on the main Community Needs Grants page. Once you have signed in, you will get an automatic email confirming that you have registered, and you'll be able to sign in with that same email and password to continue working on your application at any point. So you can enter and exit the portal and save your work. That's not a problem. No need to complete everything at once. In order to get back in, you would click on, you can return to my account at a later date. You see a link in our website that does say my account, quite literally, and you'll use those same login credentials to get back into your application. The first time so when you're registering, so your first time entering the application, starting to work on your application, there is an eligibility or an admissibility page. You will be prompted to complete these questions. You need to answer yes to all of them. In order to be ultimately, you need to answer yes, because that's how we know whether you're eligible or not. If the answer to any of these questions is no, sadly, you do not meet our eligibility criteria. So if you have any questions about any of these, or you make a mistake and answer no by accident, you should or let us know. The main thing to highlight here is that applicants must be incorporated nonprofit organizations that also hold a valid charitable number from the Canada Revenue Agency, or otherwise be a First Nations band designated as a qualified donee by the CRA. If your organization does not have a charitable status, or you are not otherwise considered a qualified donee by the CRA, we can accept an application from a partner organization that you would be working with for the purpose of this proposal and initiative. And they would, so working with a partner that does have a charity and can be mandated to receive the funds and manage the project or initiative. So the other organization's board of directors would have fiscal responsibility for the grant and be legally responsible for ensuring that the funds are spent for the charitable purposes intended and outlined in your proposal. And this organization would be required to sign a letter of agreement and work in partnership with the organization, i.e. your organization, in delivering the work. So you have completed the eligibility form. You have said yes to everything. This is ultimately your landing page for every time you will subsequently log in. You will see a list of any applications that you have started. In my case, you see here that I have one in English and French open. So when you return to your application at a later time, you will see all of the ones that are open. You'll also notice some buttons along the right-hand side of the page that are circled here that may help you for working collaboratively with your team or any partners. So the first button is transfer to a new owner. When you hover over it with your mouse, it'll also pop up and read this in language to you. So transfer to new owner. This is, you have started the application, but your executive director, for example, wants to review and complete, and they want to be the ones submitting the application. You can transfer it to them to be able to submit it. You can also manage viewers. So if you are completing the application on behalf of a team, but you want your team members and or partners to be able to see it, you can add other people to view the application. They will not be able to edit it. There is a delete button, so you've accidentally started 2 or 3 different applications. Once you know which ones you do not want to submit, you can delete them. And lastly, email a copy. Particularly helpful, perhaps right before hitting submit, you want an email of copy of the completed application form to yourself and any of your colleagues. You can send it in a PDF format to whoever you like. In the next page, you'll see at the top there are several tabs, and these will help you to navigate throughout your proposal. So the first 2 tabs include questions primarily related to your organization. So information about the number of employees, your financial information, etc. Sorry, that's the first tab. The second and third tab are really questions related to the proposed initiative. So the second one, the proposal information tab, really being the core of the questions. The supporting documents includes the uploading of your budget and other relevant attachments, audited financial statements, partner letters, etc. And the final tab allows you to review and submit your application. So this will help you to see that you have completed everything accurately and then be able to hit the submit button once you're ready. Note that most fields, although not all are mandatory, the ones that are noted with an asterisk. You can print or email yourself a draft at any point, as well as exit and continue working at a later date if you need. You have completed your application, or at least you think so, and you're ready to hit submit. If you have done like I have here and have not completed a section, you will get a text box that tells you where further information is needed or where an answer has not been completed. You will need to fix any of those before you can submit. Otherwise, you will continue to get these errors. A bit of a foolproof system on our end, perhaps a bit of a headache for others. How to stand out in a good way. So just some tips or tricks about things that we at the foundation and our committee are looking for, and things that will sadly put your application to the back of the line if you miss out on it. So how to stand out in a good way. We've spent a lot of time building out some of that information. So the guidelines, the instructions, the frequently asked questions, highly recommend reading them and reviewing them. If there's information in there that is not clear or frankly doesn't exist yet because your question is something we haven't come across before, then do reach out. But we do recommend reading and reviewing these documents prior. Submit complete application, answering clearly as you can. And I know that it says here, don't rush it. The application period is 8 weeks from when we launched last week. So we now have 7 weeks still. Recognize that it is a vacation time for a lot of people, but if no need to submit early. Take as much time as you can to pull together an application that is as complete and detailed as possible. Well, while you may have been funded or otherwise be known to the foundation. So perhaps we funded you before, perhaps we've worked in partnership before, but don't assume we know your work, primarily because it's the committee of volunteers that are reviewing the applications. They may not be as familiar with your work. So be explicit in stating your organization's approach and your previous experience with the community you're proposing to work with, as well as your experience in delivering gender-based programming. So again, you may not work exclusively in a setting with women and gender diverse folks, but you will need to highlight to us how you have previously and continue to deliver gender-based programming. And you should also really think through how to best illustrate to us the need for the funding. We know everybody needs money. This sector has no shortage of needs, but tell us what they are and how these funds will contribute to your organization's work in delivering gender-based services, programming, or supports. Here's some things not to do. So the proposal doesn't fit into the mandate of the foundation or the call for proposals. Again, this is flexible funding. There is no need to have to pull together a project plan. This funding doesn't need to be used for a project, but making sure that you tell us how the proposed work will serve women, girls, two-spirit, trans, and gender non-binary folks, excuse me, particularly those from underserved communities will be really important. Recycled proposals, many of us have worked on, I used to be in your shoes. You work on lots of proposals, sometimes simultaneously, and often you are reiterating or applying a similar concept to an application with another funder. We understand that you need to be chasing multiple opportunities at a time. Just make sure to update the proposal before you submit it to us. If it does say, if we can see that it was clearly drafted for another funder and it doesn't read like an application to Canadian Women's Foundation, it probably won't go very far in the deliberation process. Incomplete applications. So the system does not let you submit incomplete answers, but I know sometimes people will insert some X's into answers to be able to skip through to the subsequent pages. If you do that, please make sure to go back and complete the answer. And applications after the deadline will not be accepted. So our online system will close promptly at 4 p.m. Eastern time on August 6th. If you log into the system after that time, it won't let you submit it. Please do not send it to us by email after that time. It will not be considered, sadly. Of course, recognition to our donors and contributors. So the community needs grants are funded in large part by Women and Gender Equality Canada, so WAGE, or for some folks, SWC Canada, as well as the Hussian Foundation, and many other corporate, individual, and family donors. And last but not least, if anything from today's presentation, any of the online documents are not clear, or if you have questions that are not addressed in any of these, please do not hesitate to reach out by email. So you see on the screen, annualgrants@canadianwomen.org. As well as a local Toronto area number or a toll-free 1-866 number. So you can reach out any day really between now and August 6th. I will not be taking any extended vacation. So you will get a reply from me usually within a day, possibly two at the longest. So that is all for today's presentation. From me, it is now time for questions. I think folks who have already submitted them, I will address them in order. So if you have a question you've not yet typed in, please do so in the Q&A box found in your Zoom platform control bar. So first question, we received emergency funding back in December 2020 from your organization under the Safer and Stronger grant. Are we still able to apply? Are we able to still apply for this grant? The answer is yes. The only limitation is no double dipping. So if this funding that you have received is, for example, paying for a staff person up until beyond past December of 2021, you will not be able to use this community needs grant to support that person's salary, evidently. So that's the limitation, but you can apply whether you have current or previous funding from the foundation. If we have an active grant with CWF, do we use existing portal credentials to log in, or can we create an additional login? The answer is, for new grants, you still always need to register. So many of you will have submitted applications through the portal before. You still need to go to register to create a new community needs grants. So you can use the same email and password you have for previous applications, or you can create an entirely new one. New question. Do we need letters of support if we are a women's organization and if the initiative we are applying for does not involve partners? The answer to that question is no. You will see a question related to partners and an area to include partner letters. If you are proposing to do work that involves work with a project with a partner, then we will need that letter. Equally, if you are not a women's serving organization or gender-based programming has not been your forte, we highly recommend partnering with an agency that has this experience and will guide you in the development of your work. The foundation's primary focus is to support organizations that undertake gender-based programming. And so if you have not been as experienced in this regard, you should really have someone who has, and the letter from them would be expected. Other question, would a program evaluation submission as supporting documents be allowed? Absolutely. Anything that helps make the case for your intervention is helpful. So if you are applying to extend, renew, or somehow expand an existing program that you offer, if you have an evaluation that demonstrates need or the effectiveness of the intervention, absolutely our committee that reviews these applications would love to see that. It goes a long way to explaining need for an initiative. Next question, what can an organization do when they do not have any diversity policy document yet? Is there a good way to go about it? Thank you in advance for your response. Yes, many organizations do not have a diversity, anti-racism, inclusion policy, etc. Where you have something that includes those elements, please attach it. If you do not, we ask that you draft a one-pager that explains where you're at in doing that. So is it something that you're currently working on? Is it something you're thinking about? Is it something that you have no intention of doing or that is otherwise addressed through other policies? So a one-pager that explains your approach to diversity and inclusion at the staffing, operational, administrative, or program service delivery levels, and how you plan on addressing it if you don't have any said policies or processes. Next question, can you elaborate on the specific requirements for letters of support? So to reiterate, letters of support, if you can find a partner who, or a community agency, previous service user who talks about, who can, if you will, speak to the strength of the work that you've been doing, it is helpful to have. If you are working on a project that involves a partner, in that case, the partner letter should really indicate their commitment to the work and their role in undertaking this work with you. Next question. Referring to the priorities given to guidelines does not necessarily mean if our operating budget is over 1 million, we need not apply. It is a strong guideline for our committee's work. So if your budget, operational budget is over 1 million and you, and we receive many applications from organizations with less than, it means you will not be prioritized in that list. It does not mean we will not fund anyone at $1 million. So it's not a hard cutoff, but it does very much guide the committee's considerations in wanting to prioritize smaller grassroots organizations. Next question. This grant is for a single year funding. Would you like the budget to be from January to December? Generally, yes. The budget should reflect the 12 months of support, where the 12 months of support will be going. So if you are supporting operational costs, ideally it's from January to December of 2022, perhaps February. If you are looking to apply these funds towards a project and your timeline is somewhat different, I encourage you to reach out to me and we should talk about it. There is some flexibility in the timeline, but evidently we do not want to be looking at applications that are would not have work starting until perhaps September or later of 2022. We are looking to fund initiatives in 2022. Next question. If we submit an application and are unsuccessful, will we receive feedback on our application? The short answer to that is you will not receive it in a written form at the stage of letting you know. So you will receive an email in December that says, sadly, your application has not been successful. That said, if you would like more feedback on your application, you can always reach out to me after receiving that letter, and it will be in the email you receive from us. All of the contact information, etc., will be listed of where you can reach out to get that feedback. So it is done on an individual basis. Next question. Can the grant be used for both partial salary and program activities? The answer is yes. This grant money can support entirely salary amounts. It can support entirely operational or administrative costs. It can support entirely a project or initiative or any combination therein, as long as you're not putting forward items that are currently deemed ineligible. Next question. Can you share how many applications you typically receive for this funding? So this is our first time putting out a call that is this wide. Previously, our annual grants that were issued in all years up until this point were project focused. And I can say that on an average year, we receive about 190 to 200 applications, and we're funding 23, 24, perhaps 25 applications of those. Next question. Are all grants worth 20K, or may we request a smaller amount? You can request a smaller amount. The maximum is 20 grand. There is no minimum request. So if what you need is $5,000, please put in an application for 5,000. If it's 20, it's 20. If you put in a budget that asks for 22, we will fund it, and it's accepted, we will still only fund 20, not the additional 22, the additional 2. Next question. Can you please restate the eligibility for funding? Oh, sorry, here's the... Yes, can you please restate the eligibility for funding if the organization has received funding before from the foundation? The eligibility remains that you must have experience in delivering gender-based programming, and that you must be addressing or doing work that falls under one of the 4 pillar areas with some of the priority communities that are listed. If you've received funding before from the foundation, the additional consideration is that you cannot be applying for an initiative or a project that we have funded 3 times before. So if you are funding or requesting funding for, I don't know, a counseling program for survivors of sexual violence, and we have funded this 3 times before, you will need to put in an application for something else. We will not consider an application for that same work a 4th time. Next question, just clarifying this point. As this grant is flexible, it can be used to supplement an existing initiative which aligns with one of the 4 pillars of the Canadian Women's Foundation. The answer is yes. You can use it to supplement an existing initiative under one of the 4 pillar areas. It can even be used to supplement an initiative that the foundation has either already or is currently funding, as long as it is not funding things the foundation on paper has already given you money for. So if you have current funding for a program, but you have some kind of a shortage because another funder didn't come through, unfortunately, we can't do that. But if what you're doing is doing an add-on or something like that, we can accept an application for that. Next question. In addition to the under $1 million guideline, what other factors does the foundation take into consideration when classifying an organization as grassroots? Thank you. The other elements noted in sort of other roundabout ways of saying it are by women for women, or by to us LGBT communities for. So we are looking for organizations that are led by and for. So if you're a multi-service organization and all of your leadership is men, including board, senior management, et cetera, that is not necessarily something that is going to be seen in your favor. So there are questions that relate to the number of staff in your organization and board members, and how many of them identify as women, two-spirit, trans, or non-binary, for example. Other elements is that you have integrated into your work, mission, et cetera, an intersectional feminist approach. So those are other things that are fairly important, although I don't know that they go to defining you as a grassroots, but they definitely go towards defining you as an organization that whose way of working aligns with the foundation. So grassroots is, the definition of grassroots is really about the size of the organization, but there are other organizational factors that we're looking at. Next question. If we apply for project funding, does the project activity have to fall under one of the foundation's funding pillars? The answer is yes. Anything you're applying for, project, operational, administrative, you must demonstrate how your work, generally, if it's for operational or administrative, or this project addresses one of those 4 pillars. So we will not be accepting programs for things that are not identified as addressing gender-based violence, economic security, girls' empowerment, or inclusive leadership. Next question. Just to clarify, an incorporated number is not acceptable. We need a charitable number to apply. In short, the answer is yes. You must be a registered charity or qualified donee. If you are not, however, as noted, the alternative is to work with a partner that has this charitable number. So we do fund a number of initiatives whereby a organization without a charitable number is partnering with a local agency that does. The contract is issued to the organization with the charitable number. They are responsible for managing the grant, but they can often work with you to pay for the cost of delivery of a project or initiative. So if you want to run a project, let's be, for this case, a project, and your project costs are internal, some external, that ultimately they could either issue payments at various points throughout the year, or you could be invoicing them directly. There are a number of ways of working around, but you can work with a partner that has a charitable number to be able to apply together. Next question. Could an organization combine this funding with another grant opportunity, or is it mandatory that this funding be used on its own? No, the answer is you can absolutely combine this with another opportunity. Again, if you are currently being funded by the Canadian Women's Foundation, the limitation is that we cannot fund something that is being funded through another one of our streams. So if you have multi-year funding through our Rebuilding Lives grants, our Girls Fund grants, et cetera, you can apply. But if your initiative states that if, for example, you have a Girls Fund project, if those funds are dedicated to covering the costs of your after-school drop-in, that you would not be able to apply to this grant for the drop-in. You can very much, though, apply for funds to support the other administrative and wraparound costs that support that initiative. Example. Happy to talk to people, though, individually about your particular cases. If you are already receiving funding in particular, it might be important that we connect to see how it's possible. All right, I'm just moving over to our chat because I see there's a lot of questions in there, and I'm just going to make sure that we have addressed all of them. Webinar, I apologize for the delay, just wanting to make sure that everything is in. Oh, you'll also note in the chat, there is a link to today's presentation. to the slides, if you will. So if you want to be able to access the slides, you can get them in the document. I'm actually just putting it again so that it'll be at the bottom of the chat, nice and easy for you to be able to send. Okay, here's a question. Can you expand on definition of organizations led by and serving, FNMI, etc.? How is this determined, defined? Do you need a percentage of staffing board representative? It was noted, so to answer that, the answer is we do not have hard metrics on that. There is a question on number of staff you have and how many identify as women, two-spirit, non-binary, or trans folks. There is a subsequent question on how your staff, how your leadership reflects the organization served. We leave it to you to give us this explanation and be able to talk about whether or not your organization is led by and serving and provide that to us. We recognize that in some communities, the ability to have, for example, an FNMI organization that has more than 60 or 70% FNMI staff and board may be difficult, but we're looking for you to explain it to us a little bit, how it is that you have the representation that you do, where the challenges or limits are, and how you might, for example, work around. So if you have difficulties recruiting FNMI folks to staff and board, but you have other ways of ensuring participants and clients are able to feed into policies and processes, perhaps that's how you also are supporting and ensuring a reflection of needs in your practices. Next question. It was noted that you do not fund films or videos unless part of a larger project. Does the larger project have to be directly linked to the community needs grant? Funding is in place for a program, but we are hoping to use the community needs grant to create video from the program. Is increased exposure and awareness, would this be eligible? You will need to make it really clear how the program is linked to this video. So normally, we do not allow a full grant to be allocated towards the production of a film and video. So you will need to explain what supports and financial resources are currently being used towards the program. I still highly recommend, if possible, when putting towards putting in an application for the production of a video, that you're still going to have some other kind of wraparounds, honoraria, other things in place to ensure that participants are able to contribute to this production. All right, any other questions open? Oh, here we go. Let's see. Yes, another new question. Does the operating budget we report include other project funding our organization might be getting? The answer is no. We are looking for you to indicate what you need from the foundation for this initiative. If, however, you are applying for a program in particular or a project, we would like to see the full cost of said initiative with, so there will be a column for the cash amounts that you're requesting from this grant and the amounts that are being allocated from either other cash or in kind. So showing the full cost of the work is important. If you are applying for operational costs, so you are really just looking to be able to fund the cost of a staff person because your annual fundraiser was not able to happen this year and that person's salary normally comes through fundraising event dollars, for example. We don't need to see your entire organization's budget to make that allocation. In the case of a project, we do require a bit more detail. Next question. You mentioned earlier that organizations that received funding under Safer, Stronger grants are able to still apply for this grant, however, no double dipping. Can you clarify what you mean by this? Double dipping is a term that exists across all funders, including your government funders. It means you cannot bill the same expense to two different places. So if you, in this case, if you have a staff person whose salaries are already being covered through another grant, in this case, the Safer Stronger grants, that you could not also claim that salary with this grant, unless it is that the Safer Stronger grants end. For example, your funding ends August 31st, then it's fine. This grant money will only come in January. But if there were an overlap in the time periods, that you could not bill both grants for that same expense. Next question. Sorry, I meant our annual operating budget that we report as part of our eligibility. Oh, there is a question on your annual operating budget in the body of the application. What we're looking for is the budget that usually is approved by your board for your expenses for the upcoming year. So if your fiscal year is like ours, April 1 to March 31st, you probably, your board probably several months ago approved an operating budget for this year. That's the amount we will need. We do not expect at the time of submission that you'll already know what your 22 expenses are, but we would like to see what your 2021 approved budget is. If you don't know what that is or where to find it, happy to discuss with you individually by email or by phone. Got another question. I'm not sure I got this right. If we are a nonprofit organization but don't have a charitable number, we would need to apply through a charitable organization as a trustee. We don't use the word trustee, but yes, that's exactly what we're saying. If you do not have charitable or a qualified donee status, which qualified donee, there's a definition on the Canada Revenue Agency's website. Generally, we're talking about First Nations bands or hamlets that have this status. You would need to work in partnership with an organization that had charitable or qualified donee status to submit an application. Next question, is there any report that we have to provide? Yes, all of our grants come with a requirement to report at the end of your funding. The general rule of thumb is that 2 months after your funding has expired, we will want narrative report. That includes, in this case, what you did with the money. So seeing a bit of a budget template breakdown where the money was actually spent compared to what you had anticipated spending it. It is okay if you shift money, but we just want to see where it has gone. If what you intended to do with the money was service delivery focused, we will ask for some participant breakdowns. So how many clients were served by this project, and some demographic questions about those participants, as well as other questions around what you did, how the project or the initiative pivoted or shifted, what you've learned. So generally less than a dozen questions, but it is perhaps a 5-page report due 2 months after the funding expires. Another question, are renovations an eligible expense? No, they are not. They are covered under the capital expense ineligible category. We cannot fund renovations, restorations, building projects of any kind. You can apply for equipment. So if that's, and when I say equipment, it could be a computer or technology-based things, tablets perhaps for your participants. If you're operating a shelter, maybe you need to buy some new, things for the residences. Again, not major equipment expenses. We are looking at smaller things that help fill a gap, but it could not be the majority of your budget. And I am not seeing any other questions. And I'm just looking over to my colleague, Michelle, in the chat box to send along anything else if I've missed it, but I think we're good. So I will say thank you to you all for joining today. We Again, to reiterate, I am around pretty much every day from now till August 6th. So if you have a question or a comment, or you just want to throw around your idea and see if it's something that the foundation might be able to or want to fund, you have my email, my local Toronto, or my toll-free number and extension on the screen. They are also available in all of the documents that we have published on our community grants, needs grants webpage that, thank you, Michelle, has just linked in the chat. So I thank you all for joining us today. Hope you have a safe, restful, and happy National Indigenous Peoples Day. Thank you all. Have a good one.